We will be covering 9.5, Part 1 today. This is Calls for Reform and Responses. This is a longer section, so we will divide this into two parts. All right, so this section looks at human rights after 1900. So after 1900, human rights became a topic of global discourse. This is kind of the summary sentence for this section. So efforts were made by the United Nations and other non-government organizations to establish and to protect human rights throughout the world. All right, so an era of rights. So in 1948, the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this document said that we as humans have certain basic rights and freedoms that are given to us simply because we are human. So without regard to our race or our religion or ethnicity or whatever crazy political opinion we might have, we should have these certain rights. And so that was their statement that, formalized their opinion on human rights, or the UN perspective on human rights. The UN also created UNICEF, which stands for United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund. Thankful for the acronym there, because that is a lot of words. But this one was established in 1946 because there were children, especially in Europe, who were still facing poverty and hunger a year or more after World War II is over. So this was created by the UN in order to feed children who were still suffering the devastation of World War II. All right, so on top of that, the United Nations one of the jobs of the United Nations has been to look into and to investigate any type of human rights abuses. So genocide, war crimes, crimes against women or children, any type of government oppression or things like that, the United Nations tries to investigate and send help where necessary. The International Court of Justice, sometimes called the World Court, is a United Nations court, and their job is basically to solve problems. Most of what they deal with is border disputes between countries and treaty violations. And interestingly, so they have 15 judges, but each of them have to be a citizen of a different country so that there won't be like any nation overrepresented on the World Court, to make sure that they have an objective group of people who can solve problems. The United Nations also protects refugees. Those are people who are forced to flee their home country, usually in times of war, or if there's been a natural disaster or several years of bad harvest or famine or things like that. People will leave their country and seek safe haven in another place. And so the United Nations tries to provide food, medication, and temporary shelter for refugees. The earliest refugees that they protected were actually people in Palestine who were displaced because of the creation of Israel in 1948. All right, so global feminism, I guess the hallmark of global feminism was the Women's March on January 21st of 2017. Women from all over the country marched on Washington. 500,000 demonstrators came and just advocated women's rights. Most of it had to do with the right to birth control and abortion and the right to equal pay. But interestingly, after this, there were several other women's marches throughout the world, all over the place. It is important to note that the Women's March was not the first global feminist movement. There have been several. There's actually a chart on your book on page 668 where you can look through those. But there have been several conferences or marches or things like that, just of women gathering in order to fight for women's rights. In 1979, there was a convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, and they laid out several rights and protections that global feminists should have, or that all women should have. They said that all women should have the right to vote, the right to hold office, the right to freely choose a spouse. There are still arranged marriages in some places. Access to the same type of education that men have, birth control, and then family planning, but that's basically disguised as abortion. They want the right to abort their child. All right. And then another movement which started in French West Africa was the Negritude movement. And basically this celebrates and emphasizes pride in Blackness, the pride of being African, and the pride of having a distinct and unique African culture. One of the leaders of this was a guy named Senegal, or a guy from Senegal, who later became the first president. His name was Leopold Sedar Senghor, and he wrote all sorts of poetry about the beauty of African culture. And this Negritude movement actually influenced what we now know as the as Black Pride, or the Black Pride movement of the 60s, was rooted in this Negritude movement. All right, so looking at steps toward gender equality. So the 20th century has actually seen a lot of gains in gender equality. More women than ever are learning to read and write and are attending college and are gaining positions of power and things like that. So there have been great gains in the 1900s for women. There have, however, been, this is kind of ironic, but unequal equality. And a couple of examples of that, like one from the United States, is that when the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920, it gave women the right to vote. But the problem was Native American women and African American women were discriminated against and robbed of their voting rights in some states until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so not all women had this equality. The same was true in Britain, where the right to vote was granted in 1918, but it was only for women over 30, and it was only for women who had a certain amount of property. And they weren't given like an equal right to vote, like equal with men, until 1928. And then in Australia, they actually got started early. So women gained some voting rights in 1894, but they did not allow the Aborigine women, those are the natives to Australia, to vote until 1962. And so this has been, I guess an unequal equality, and that some were given the right, but not all. All right, so we are going to stop there, and we will pick up tomorrow with the second part of 9.5. So y'all have a great day. Don't forget to send me a picture of your notes.